The alchemist stands before the furnace, not as a primitive chemist fumbling with base metals, but as a philosopher confronting the most profound question ever posed to human consciousness. What is the nature of transformation itself? This is where the story begins, not in the laboratories of medieval Europe, nor in the temples of Hellenistic Egypt, but in the psychological crisis that defines the human condition. The Magnum Opus, the great work of alchemy, has been systematically misunderstood for centuries, reduced to either naive proto-chemistry or dismissed as mystical obfuscation. Both interpretations miss the essential truth that Carl Jung recognized in the 20th century. Alchemy is a symbolic language, describing the process of psychological individuation, the birth of the authentic self from the undifferentiated chaos of unconscious existence. The spark that ignites this journey is not intellectual curiosity but existential necessity. It emerges from what the alchemists called the Prima Materia, the first matter, that raw, unformed substance which represents the psyche in its initial state of fragmentation and potential. In psychological terms, this is the moment when an individual becomes aware of their own incompleteness, when the constructed persona begins to crack under the weight of repressed shadow material, when life's suffering can no longer be explained away by comfortable narratives. The alchemists understood that true transformation cannot begin from a place of comfort or complacency. It requires what they called the massa confusa, the confused mass, a state of psychological disorientation where old certainties dissolve and the ego's pretensions to mastery are revealed as illusion. This initial phase is characterized by profound discomfort. The individual experiences what Jung termed psychic inflation, followed by its inevitable collapse. The realization that the personality one has constructed is not identical with the self, that beneath the social mask lies a wilderness of unintegrated contents. The alchemical texts speak of finding the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, hidden in the most despised and rejected material. This is not metaphor for its own sake. It is precise psychological observation. The work of self-realization begins precisely where the ego does not want to look, in the symptoms, the neuroses, the dreams that disturb comfortable sleep, the shadows cast by the bright light of conscious identity. The quest for the Magnum Opus emerges from this recognition that something essential has been lost or never developed, that the life being lived is somehow not one's own life, that beneath the surface of daily existence pulses a demand for authenticity that can no longer be ignored. The philosophical architecture underlying the Magnum Opus rests on several foundational principles that distinguish authentic alchemical work from mere wish fulfillment or spiritual bypassing. The first principle is that transformation is not transcendence. The alchemists did not seek to escape matter, but to redeem it. To discover the gold hidden within led not by abandoning the lead, but by recognizing its essential nature. In psychological terms, this means that individuation does not proceed by rejecting the body, the unconscious or the shadow, but by integrating these rejected elements into a larger wholeness. The dream of spiritual purity, of ascending beyond the messy complications of embodied existence, is precisely what the alchemical tradition rejects as inflation, the ego's fantasy of godhood that actually prevents genuine transformation. Jung recognized that alchemical symbolism provided what Western philosophy had largely abandoned after the Enlightenment, a coherent map of the psyche's self-organizing capacity. The alchemists understood that the psyche possesses an inherent tendency toward wholeness, what they called the lapis, or the filius philosophorum, the philosopher's child, an image of psychic totality that emerges from the union of opposites. This is not a passive process of waiting for grace or enlightenment to descend from above, but an active engagement with the material of one's own life. The alchemist must become what they called the artifex, the artist or craftsperson, who consciously participates in the work of transformation. This role requires both humility, recognizing that one does not create the self ex nihilo, and responsibility, acknowledging that without conscious participation, the potential for wholeness remains unrealized. The central doctrine can be expressed through the alchemical axiom solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. This principle captures the essential rhythm of psychological development. First comes dissolution, the breaking down of rigid ego structures, the liquefaction of fixed attitudes, the death of cherished identifications. This is the Nigredo, the blackening, which we will explore in detail later, but its theoretical importance must be understood now. Without dissolution, there can be no genuine transformation, only the rearrangement of existing elements into new patterns of self-deception. The ego must experience its own death, not literally but symbolically, in order to discover that it is not identical with consciousness itself. Following dissolution comes coagulation, the emergence of new forms, the crystallization of insight into character, the gradual birth of an integrated personality that can hold paradox without fragmenting. This is not a return to the original state, but the emergence of something genuinely new. Not the naive ego of youth, but what the alchemists called the rebis or hermaphrodite, an image of the self that contains and reconciles masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, spiritual and material principles. Jung saw in these images the psyche's own wisdom about its developmental potential, a wisdom that predates and exceeds theoretical psychology. The doctrine also insists on what the alchemists called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. This does not mean opposition to natural law, but rather the recognition that psychological development requires something beyond natural processes alone. It requires consciousness, intentionality, and ethical engagement. Left to itself, the psyche follows the principle of entropy. Energy flows toward dissipation, conflict remains unresolved, potentials atrophy. The Magnum Opus is against nature, in the sense that it demands conscious intervention in psychological processes that would otherwise remain unconscious and therefore unrealized. This is the burden of human freedom. We are the only creatures capable of participating consciously in our own transformation, and this capability carries with it an ethical imperative. Finally, the doctrine emphasizes that the work is both individual and universal. Each person must undertake their own magnum opus. No one can individuate on behalf of another. Yet the images and symbols that emerge in this process are not merely personal but archetypal, drawn from a collective unconscious that transcends individual biography. This explains why the alchemical symbols resonate across cultures and centuries. They describe something fundamental about human psychological structure. The birth of the self is simultaneously the most intimate and the most impersonal event. Intimate because it involves one's unique history and constitution. Impersonal because it follows patterns inherent in the psyche itself. The alchemical tradition describes the magnum opus as proceeding through distinct stages, though it must be emphasized that these are not linear steps, but recursive phases that repeat at deeper levels throughout the work. The classical formulation speaks of the Nigredo, blackening, Albedo, whitening, citrinitas, yellowing, and Rubedo, reddening, though some traditions collapse the middle stages. Understanding these phases psychologically reveals the profound wisdom embedded in alchemical symbolism. The Nigredo represents the initial encounter with the shadow, the descent into what Jung called the personal unconscious. This phase is characterized by depression, confusion, and the dissolution of ego structures. The alchemical texts describe this stage with images of death, putrefaction, and darkness. The caput mortuum, the death's head, appears frequently. Psychologically, the Nigredo occurs when the persona can no longer sustain itself, when life circumstances or inner pressures force a confrontation with aspects of the personality that have been repressed or denied. This might manifest as a midlife crisis, a breakdown of meaning following loss or trauma, or simply the accumulated weight of living inauthentically until the psychic pressure becomes unbearable. The Nigredo is not pathology to be cured, but a necessary stage of transformation. The alchemists knew that in stercor invenitur, in filth it is found. The philosopher's stone, the potential for wholeness, lies precisely in the material the ego finds most disgusting and threatening. A person who encounters their own capacity for cruelty, their sexual desires that contradict their moral self-image, their envy of those they claim to love, their profound ambivalence about responsibilities they have supposedly chosen, this person is in the Nigredo. The temptation is always to flee back to unconsciousness, to reassert ego control through repression, projection, or spiritual bypassing. But the alchemical tradition insists that one must descend fully into the darkness, must allow the dissolution to complete itself. In this phase, the individual often experiences what the mystics called the dark night of the soul, though the alchemical perspective is more embodied and psychological than traditional mysticism. The darkness is not punishment or test, but revelation. It reveals the actual contents of the psyche, as opposed to the ego's preferred self-image. Dreams during this period often feature images of decay, descents into underground places, encounters with threatening figures. The task is not to fight these images, but to attend to them, to allow them to speak, to recognize that they are not invasions from outside, but aspects of one's own totality seeking integration. The transition from Nigredo to Albedo occurs when consciousness begins to emerge from identification with the darkness. The albedo is traditionally associated with lunar consciousness, with reflection rather than direct solar illumination. Psychologically, this represents the development of what Jung called the observing ego, the capacity to witness one's own psychological processes without immediate identification. In the albedo, one begins to see patterns, to recognize how the personal shadow connects to broader archetypal themes, to distinguish between the observing self and the contents being observed. This phase is characterized by clarification and distillation. The alchemist spoke of washing, purifying, separating the subtle from the gross. In psychological work, this involves discriminating between genuine insight and defensive intellectualization, between authentic emotion and sentimental indulgence, between the voice of the self and the demands of the superego disguised as spiritual authority. The albedo brings a certain coolness, a detachment that is not dissociation but conscious distance. One learns to hold psychological contents in awareness without being overwhelmed by them. The danger of the albedo is premature spiritualization, what Jung called the cold light of the moon. There is a temptation to remain in reflective consciousness, to become the eternal observer, to mistake psychological insight for transformation itself. Some spiritual traditions promote this state as ultimate realization, but the alchemical perspective recognizes it as incomplete. The albedo is necessary but not sufficient. It provides clarity but not yet integration, understanding but not yet embodiment. The Rubedo, the reddening, represents the final phase of the work, though final must be understood as relative. The Magnum Opus is never truly complete, but reaches provisional fulfillment in this stage. The Rubedo is associated with solar consciousness, with active engagement with life, with the embodiment of insights gained in earlier phases. The color red symbolizes blood, life, incarnation, the return to embodied existence, but now with transformed consciousness. In Jung's terminology, this is the realization of the self, the birth of an integrated personality that can contain and consciously relate to the full spectrum of psychological contents. In the Rubedo, opposites that were split in the Nigredo and observed in the Albedo are now united. The alchemical image for this is the Coniunctio, the sacred marriage or hieros gamos, depicted as the union of king and queen, sun and moon, masculine and feminine principles. This is not a fusion that eliminates difference, but a dynamic relationship that preserves polarity while transcending opposition. Psychologically, it represents the ego's new relationship with the self, no longer identified with it, inflation, nor alienated from it, repression, but in conscious dialogue. The Rubedo manifests in life as what Jung called personality number 2, not a second personality in the pathological sense, but the emergence of a centered authority that is not merely ego. This is the person who has integrated the shadow and can therefore act ethically without moralistic rigidity, who has encountered the archetypes and can therefore relate to others without projection, who has suffered the death of ego and therefore no longer fears death in the same way. The Rubedo produces what the alchemists called the filius sapientiae, the child of wisdom, or the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone. images of achieved wholeness that nevertheless remain open to further development. Throughout all these stages, certain operations recur: calcinatio, burning; solutio, dissolving; sublimatio, elevating; mortificatio, killing; separatio, dividing; and coniunctio, uniting. Each operation corresponds to specific psychological work. Calcinatio burns away the inessential through the fire of affect and suffering. Solutio dissolves rigid boundaries through immersion in unconscious material. Sublimatio elevates raw instinct into symbolic expression. Mortificatio kills identification with provisional ego structures. Separatio discriminates between psychic contents. Coniunctio unites what has been separated into a higher synthesis. These operations do not occur once, but repeatedly, in spiraling cycles that deepen the work. At the heart of the Magnum Opus lies an unavoidable confrontation with what might be called existential despair, though the term barely captures the depth of the crisis. This is the moment when the alchemical vessel threatens to shatter, when the heat of transformation becomes unbearable, when the practitioner questions whether the work is worth the suffering it demands. The alchemical texts warn of this danger in images of the mortificatio, the death operation, and in cautionary tales of alchemists who abandoned the work or went mad in its pursuit. Jung understood this phase as the encounter with what he called the absolute, with content so powerful that ego consciousness risks being overwhelmed entirely. This crisis typically emerges at the transition from Nigredo to Albedo, though it can recur at any stage when the psyche reorganizes around a more comprehensive center. It is characterized by a profound sense of meaninglessness that cannot be resolved through rational argument or spiritual platitudes. The individual has dismantled old meanings through the Nigredo, but has not yet crystallized new ones. They find themselves in what the alchemists called massa confusa at its most acute. Everything previously relied upon for orientation has dissolved, yet nothing new has emerged to replace it. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may coincide with it, but rather an ontological crisis, a questioning of the very ground of existence. The temptation at this stage is to retreat into cynicism or nihilism, to conclude that, because conventional meanings have proven inadequate, no meaning exists at all. This is the voice of what Jung called the negative mother archetype, the devouring aspect of the unconscious that would pull consciousness back into undifferentiated fusion. The alchemists represented this danger in images of the dragon, the devouring wolf, or the corrupting putrefaction that goes too far and produces not transformation, but decay. Many spiritual seekers abort the process at this point, either fleeing back to conventional life with renewed defenses, or escaping forward into spiritual inflation, claiming premature realization to avoid the full descent. But the alchemical tradition insists that this crisis is necessary and even generative. It is in the darkest phase of putrefaction that the cauda pavonis, the peacock's tail, begins to appear, that iridescent play of colors signaling that new life is emerging from decay. The encounter with meaninglessness is not the end of the work, but the precondition for discovering authentic meaning as opposed to inherited or constructed meanings. This is the difference between what Kierkegaard called objective and subjective truth, between knowing about meaning and experiencing meaning as the ground of one's own existence. The way through this crisis does not come through effort or understanding, but through what the alchemist called patience, suffering, or undergoing. One must allow the process to complete itself rather than trying to control or escape it. This requires an almost superhuman patience and trust in the psyche's self-regulating capacity. Jung observed that at this critical juncture, many individuals experience what he called numinous dreams, or encounters with the self in spontaneous imaginal events, experiences that cannot be willed, but seem to arise from the depths as a kind of grace. These experiences do not remove the suffering, but recontextualize it, revealing it as meaningful within a larger pattern. The existential crisis also forces a confrontation with death, not death as biological ending, but death as psychological necessity. The ego must die to its pretensions of sovereignty, must accept that it is not the center of the personality, must relinquish control to a larger ordering principle. This is experienced as annihilation because, from the ego's perspective, it is annihilation. The alchemist spoke of the solve et coagula as involving a real death before the rebirth, not metaphorical. The person who emerges from the Rubedo is not the same person who entered the Nigredo. Continuity of memory does not mean continuity of identity. This phase also reveals the ethical dimension of the Magnum Opus. The work requires facing one's own capacity for evil, recognizing that the shadow contains not just personal failings, but participation in collective patterns of violence, exploitation, and destruction. Jung insisted that without confronting this moral reality, individuation becomes merely psychological narcissism, self-development pursued for its own sake. The crisis forces the question, for what purpose does one undertake this work? If the answer is merely personal happiness or spiritual attainment, the work will fail. The true answer, when it comes, is that one works not for oneself alone, but in service to something larger, the emergence of consciousness itself as a value in the cosmos. The individual who completes a cycle of the Magnum Opus, and it must be emphasized that completion is always provisional as the work continues throughout life, emerges transformed in ways that are simultaneously dramatic and subtle. This is the paradox of integration. The changes are profound yet often invisible to external observation. The person appears to live an ordinary life, engaging in mundane activities, yet the quality of consciousness informing these activities has fundamentally shifted. The alchemists captured this in the image of the philosopher's stone, which looks like an ordinary rock yet possesses extraordinary properties. Integration means the establishment of a viable relationship between ego and self, between consciousness and the unconscious. The ego retains its function as the center of conscious awareness and executive agency, but it no longer identifies itself as the totality of the personality. Instead, it recognizes itself as servant to a larger organizing principle, what Jung called the self, represented in alchemical symbolism by the lapis, the rebis, or the filius philosophorum. This shift in psychic economy has profound implications for how one lives. Decisions are no longer made solely on the basis of ego preferences or external demands, but through consultation with this deeper center, often experienced as an inner voice or guiding intuition. The integrated individual exhibits what Jung called psychological objectivity, the capacity to observe oneself and others without excessive identification or projection. They recognize that the contents of consciousness, including emotions, thoughts, and desires, are phenomena to be witnessed and related to rather than states one simply is. This does not produce cold detachment, but rather a quality of presence that can fully engage with experience while maintaining awareness of its constructed and transient nature. They can feel profound emotion without being tyrannized by it, can hold strong convictions without dogmatism, can commit to relationships and projects while recognizing their contingency. Another mark of integration is the capacity to hold paradox without premature resolution. The alchemical rebis, the double-natured being, symbolizes this ability to contain opposites in conscious tension. The integrated person recognizes that truth often presents itself in paradoxical formulations, that wisdom involves both, and rather than either or thinking, that psychological and spiritual development requires embracing contradictions that the rational mind finds intolerable. They can be simultaneously strong and vulnerable, autonomous and relational, passionate and detached, because these are no longer experienced as contradictions, but as complementary aspects of wholeness. Integration also manifests as what Jung called the realization of the self in embodied existence. This is not transcendence of the body or material reality, but their transfiguration through consciousness. The integrated individual experiences instinct and spirit not as opposing forces, but as two aspects of a single energy. Sexuality becomes not just biological drive, but symbolic expression. Food and drink become not just sustenance, but sacrament. Work becomes not just survival, but vocation. This is what the alchemists meant by transforming lead into gold, not escaping material existence, but discovering its inherent value. Perhaps most significant is the development of what might be called authentic authority. The person who has completed a cycle of the Magnum Opus carries a certain weight, a gravitas that comes not from external credentials or social position, but from the depth of their encounter with the self. They speak not just from opinion or theory, but from experience that has been tested in the crucible of suffering and integration. This authority does not seek followers or claim infallibility. Rather, it naturally evokes recognition in others who sense the presence of genuine realization. Yet integration does not produce perfection or eliminate suffering. The integrated individual remains fully human, subject to error, limitation, and the vicissitudes of existence. What changes is not the content of life, but the context. Suffering is no longer experienced as meaningless, but as meaningful, as contributing to the ongoing work of consciousness. The integrated person has learned what the alchemists knew, that the Magnum Opus is never finished, that each completion opens onto a new cycle, that transformation is not a state to be achieved, but a process to be lived. The ultimate result of integration is what might be called the birth of the authentic self, not the false self constructed by ego defenses and social conditioning, but the unique configuration of consciousness that represents one's essential nature. This self is paradoxically both created through the work and discovered as having always already existed as potential. It is what the alchemists called the filius sapientiae, the child of wisdom, the new being born from the sacred marriage of opposites. This birth does not occur once, but is renewed continuously through ongoing engagement with the work. It is simultaneously the goal and the means, the product and the process, the stone and the philosopher, seeking the stone. The gold you seek is not forged in the crucible, but in the consciousness that tends the flame. For the Magnum Opus teaches what the wise have always known. Transformation is not discovered in substances, but in the disciplined attention that transmutes suffering into wisdom, shadow into light, and the lead of unconscious existence into the gold of awakened life.